I stood at the back of the church, veiled in black like a specter no one recognized, watching strangers mourn a man whose breath I'd felt against my neck just 3 nights before. The polished mahogany coffin gleamed under spotlight beams that cut through stained glass, creating kaleidoscope patterns across its closed lid. Closed because there was nothing inside but sandbags and secrets. His daughter from his first marriage read a eulogy describing a father I never knew. A man who always came to ballet recitals and remembered birthdays, whose laughter filled rooms and whose generosity knew no bounds. I bit my tongue until I tasted copper, the familiar tang of truth swallowed for survival. The woman in the front pew, his current wife, though not his last, dabbed at eyes dry behind designer sunglasses, her performance flawless except for how often she checked her watch, perhaps calculating how quickly inheritance could be converted to cash. For 18 months, I carried the weight of his whispered plan like stones in my pockets, dragging me deeper into waters where breathing became secondary to keeping our secret submerged. Just until the investigation ends, he'd promised on our last genuine night together, his fingers tracing the curve of my spine in the darkness of a motel room paid for in cash. Just until the accounts are unfrozen, until the federal agents lose interest, until I can transfer enough to disappear completely. With you. I nodded against his chest, believing the lie because the alternative, that I was merely another asset being strategically positioned, was too humiliating to acknowledge. So I helped him vanish, purchased the unregistered boat, memorized the coordinates for the midnight transfer to the waiting yacht, learned to answer police questions with precisely the right mixture of confusion and distress. His wedding ring now hung from a chain between my breasts, hidden beneath clothes too simple to suggest the complicated geometry of our arrangement. The obituary called it a tragic boating accident, the body lost to the merciless sea, the family requesting privacy during this unimaginable time of grief. What remained unprinted, how his offshore accounts had been receiving wire transfers for years from companies that existed only on paper, how federal investigators had begun connecting scattered dots into a constellation of fraud, how the accident occurred precisely 3 days after the first subpoena arrived at his office. I sat through 6 interviews with stone-faced agents who showed me photographs of luxury condominiums in countries without extradition treaties, asked if I recognized the blonde woman beside him in surveillance images from Singapore, Rio, Bali. He was my husband's business associate, I said each time, the lie smooth as river stones tumbling from my tongue. I handled the catering for their corporate events. They never asked about the text messages still arriving on my burner phone, the coordinates for our eventual reunion becoming the constellations by which I navigated my careful performance of widowhood. Have you ever lived a double life so completely that the boundary between truth and deception becomes a shifting shoreline, constantly redrawn by the tide of necessity? I moved through my days like a method actor never allowed to break character. Shopping for groceries I would prepare alone, maintaining a garden he would never see bloom, answering condolence cards with grateful notes about a grief I only performed. Neighbors brought casseroles and concerned smiles, offering support for a loss that existed only in newspaper headlines and funeral programs I saved in a box beneath my bed. At night, I would stand before the bathroom mirror, rehearsing expressions of sorrow while simultaneously planning which possessions could fit into a single suitcase, which documents would need to be falsified, which parts of myself could be abandoned in service to this elaborate disappearance. The reflection staring back became increasingly unfamiliar, a woman capable of deceptions I once would have judged unforgivable in others. Tomorrow marks 1 year since the funeral, where I wasn't welcome but attended anyway. 1 year of perfectly executed widowhood, while secretly preparing for resurrection. The burner phone in my drawer contains final instructions, a departure date, an account number, passport details for a woman who shares my face but not my name. What no one at that funeral could have possibly imagined was that the greatest performance wasn't the wife's tears or the daughter's eulogy. It was my absence from the official narrative, my erasure from his life's documentation, my willing transformation into a footnote rather than a chapter heading. Because some stories can only continue when certain characters agree to disappear. when certain truths remain buried in empty coffins under cemetery grounds too respectable for the complications of reality. And as I pack the single suitcase permitted for my new life, I can't help wondering which will prove more difficult: the years spent pretending he was dead, or the years ahead pretending I never existed. Morning light filters through dusty blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the kitchen counter where I stand. Knife suspended over half-cut vegetables that will become a meal for one. The burner phone vibrates against the cutting board, its black plastic casing stark against the worn wood. A technological tumor growing in the heart of my carefully constructed widowhood. 364 days since I stood at the back of the church, watching strangers mourn a man whose heartbeat I'd felt against my palm just days before. 364 days of perfectly performed grief, of neighbors' casseroles accepted with downcast eyes, of condolence cards displayed on the mantel like perverse trophies. The phone vibrates again, insistent as conscience, as the lie that's become too large to contain within ordinary rooms and ordinary conversations. I place the knife down carefully, fingers trembling slightly as I reach for the phone. This isn't the first message this week. They've been increasing in frequency as the anniversary approaches, as James grows more impatient in whatever luxury hideaway he's fashioned from our betrayal. Our betrayal. The phrase catches in my throat like a fishbone, sharp, foreign, impossible to swallow or cough up completely. When did I become someone capable of this deception? When did "until death do us part" transform into "until federal investigators start connecting dots"? The kitchen clock ticks with merciless precision, counting seconds of a life suspended between what was and what waits across oceans, in countries with no extradition treaties, in a future purchased with other people's retirement funds and children's college savings. The message glows against the screen. Final arrangements confirmed. Passport and tickets arrive tomorrow. 7 days until reunion. Delete after reading. The clinical efficiency of James's communications. Always instructions, never questions. Certainly never expressions of missing me or recognizing what I've sacrificed to maintain this elaborate fiction. I delete the message as instructed. Muscle memory performing the small acts of complicity that have become as routine as morning coffee. Through the window, I can see Mrs. Tanner watering her hydrangeas, occasionally glancing toward my house with that particular expression of concerned curiosity that has become familiar from neighbors who still don't quite know how to interact with the widow of the community's most respected investment advisor, the man whose tragic boating accident made regional news before being eclipsed by fresher tragedies. The refrigerator hums in the corner, its steady drone providing background to my racing thoughts. Inside sits a half-empty bottle of champagne, not for celebration, but for practice. Each night this week, I've poured a single glass, letting the bubbles dissolve on my tongue while rehearsing reactions to seeing James again after a year of separation. Will I embrace him without hesitation? Will anger finally surface through the layers of accommodation and justification I've built to make this bearable? The champagne turns sour in my mouth as I imagine the moment, as I contemplate which version of myself will emerge when fiction becomes reality, when the widow transforms back into wife, when the woman who has lived alone in grief meets the man who orchestrated his own death with her reluctant assistance. The photo albums in the bookcase stand like sentinels of a past everyone agrees existed. I flip through them sometimes, touching the faces captured in better times, as if confirmation might seep through my fingertips. Here we all are at the lake house, James on my shoulders, both of us laughing. Here at his retirement party, his arm around me, pride beaming from both our faces. Was I a good wife then? When did I become someone to manage, to handle, to doubt? The subtle shift from, "How are you feeling, Elise?" to, "Have you considered downsizing, Elise?" didn't escape my attention. Nor did the silent exchanges between James and his business partners when they thought my attention had wandered with age rather than sharpened with suspicion. The night before the stroke that delivered me to this sterile purgatory, I sat at my cherrywood desk, the same desk where I'd written their college recommendation letters, signed their first car loans, drafted the will that would have made them wealthy beyond their already considerable comfort. The vegetables on the cutting board wilt slightly in the late morning heat, forgotten in the moment the phone demanded attention. I should finish making lunch, should continue the performance of normalcy that has become my primary occupation. James's daughter will be calling this afternoon, as she does every Sunday, dutiful despite our strained relationship, to check on me, to update me on the ongoing legal battles with the investment firm's former clients, to unconsciously probe for any slip that might suggest I know more than I've admitted. I've become skilled at these conversations, at expressing appropriate concern while maintaining ignorance of the financial details, at asking about her children while deflecting questions about my future plans. Does she sense the half-truths beneath my careful words? Does some instinct warn her that the woman who was her father's second wife knows exactly where he is? Exactly how much money he salvaged before the collapse? Exactly which day she'll never hear from either of us again? The knife feels heavier when I pick it up again, weighted with knowledge, with complicity, with the understanding that each vegetable sliced brings me one motion closer to the day I'll walk out of this house for the last time. The burner phone sits silent now, tucked into the pocket of my apron like a secret kept close to the heart. 7 days. 7 more performances of widowhood. 7 more mornings waking in a bed that holds only my body but 2 people's crimes. The cutting board collects the small violence of my preparations: carrots sectioned with mechanical precision, onions that provide convenient explanation for unexpected tears, tomatoes bleeding seeds across the wooden surface. There's something confessional about preparing food this way, something ritualistic about transformation through controlled destruction. Outside, Mrs. Tanner has finished with her gardening and now stands at her mailbox, collecting today's delivery with the unhurried movements of someone whose life continues along expected tracks, whose future extends predictably from her past. Our eyes meet briefly across the distance between our properties, her gaze carrying that particular mixture of sympathy and curiosity that has become familiar, my own carefully composed into the appropriate mask of grateful acknowledgement. What would she say if she knew? What would any of them say if they understood that the grieving widow was actually an accomplice, that the tragic accident was meticulously planned, that the empty coffin they lowered into manicured cemetery grounds was simply the most visible prop in an elaborate performance designed to allow a criminal to escape with millions while his wife maintained the fiction of his death? The afternoon sun slants across the living room, turning dust motes into floating constellations above the coffee table where I've arranged the photo albums, visual evidence of a life interrupted, of a marriage that existed before it transformed into elaborate fiction. James smiles from behind glass frames, his arm around my shoulders at our wedding, his hand clasping his daughter's at her college graduation, his expression confident and open in dozens of captured moments that now feel like exhibits in a case against us both. The federal agents who visited weekly in those first months after the accident studied these photos with professional intensity, looking for clues in the tilt of his head, the placement of his hands, any signal that might suggest a man planning to disappear rather than one contentedly building a life. They never noticed what I see now, how his smile never quite reached his eyes in that last year, how he gradually positioned himself at the edges of group photos as if already beginning to erase himself, how his gaze often fixed on something beyond the frame, perhaps the future he was already constructing without most of us in it. The grandfather clock in the corner strikes 3, the inheritance from James's parents that his daughter wanted, but he insisted should remain with me, because someone needs to wind it properly. Its steady rhythm has marked the passing of 364 days of solitude, of rehearsed grief, of midnight calls on encrypted lines that leave me sleepless until dawn. I run my fingers along the brass pendulum housing, feeling the cool metal warm beneath my touch. This clock has witnessed every lie I've told since that night James outlined his plan at our kitchen table, his voice low and urgent as he explained how the investment firm was imploding, how client funds had been temporarily allocated to projects that failed, how federal investigators were assembling a case that would send him to prison for decades unless he vanished completely. The clock knows how I protested at first, how my initial horror gradually gave way to reluctant participation, how each step into complicity felt simultaneously like drowning and like the only possible way to breathe. The burner phone weighs heavy in my pocket as I move through the room, straightening pillows that need no straightening, adjusting curtains already perfectly aligned, the purposeless activities that fill hours otherwise consumed by anticipation and dread. 7 days until departure. 7 days until I abandon this carefully maintained shrine to a marriage that transformed into something unrecognizable when tested by consequences. The interior designer James hired when we first moved in selected every piece in this room. The overstuffed sofa in precisely the right shade of dove gray, the artfully arranged bookshelves displaying leather-bound classics neither of us ever read, the abstract paintings chosen to complement the color scheme rather than to move the soul. How fitting that our life together was curated by someone else. That authenticity was sacrificed for appearance long before James suggested the ultimate deception. A car door slams outside, the sound snapping through my thoughts like a warning shot. Through sheer force of habit, I move to the window, peeking through curtains to identify the visitor before they reach my door. It's Diane from 3 houses down, carrying what appears to be another casserole, another offering to the altar of my fraudulent bereavement. My stomach tightens with a familiar mixture of guilt and resentment. Guilt for accepting kindness under false pretenses, resentment toward these neighbors whose continued solicitude makes my daily performance both necessary and increasingly difficult. What would happen if I opened the door and spoke the truth? James isn't dead. He's living under an assumed name in a country that won't extradite him to face charges of investment fraud. I'm joining him next week. Would you like your casserole dish back before I go? The absurdity of the imagined confession almost triggers inappropriate laughter, a dangerous crack in the facade I've maintained with such exhausting precision. The doorbell chimes, its cheerful tone incongruous with the weight of secrets pressing against my chest. I smooth my features into the appropriate mask, grief softened by time but still visibly present, gratitude for community support, the quiet dignity expected of a woman learning to live alone. The rehearsed expressions feel like a second skin now, more familiar than authentic emotion, more habitual than the truth I can barely remember beneath layers of calculated fiction. What was I like before this? What did genuine reactions feel like before every response became performance? The questions flutter through my mind as I move toward the door, as I prepare to accept another gift I don't deserve, to speak gratitude I don't feel, to perpetuate a deception that has consumed my identity so completely that I sometimes wonder if there will be anything left of me when the curtain finally falls. Helen, I brought chicken divan. I remember James always loved it at neighborhood potlucks. Diane's voice carries that particular tone people adopt when speaking to the bereaved. Gentle, slightly higher pitched than normal, carefully modulated to convey sympathy without triggering excessive emotion. The casserole dish passes from her hands to mine, still warm beneath my fingers. The weight of food prepared with genuine care for someone who has betrayed that care in ways Diane cannot imagine. The anniversary must be difficult, she continues, her eyes searching mine for appropriate signs of renewed grief. We've all been thinking about you this week. The collective we encompasses a community that would shun me instantly if they knew what waits in my future, what I've harbored in my past, what deception connects the 2 points like a thread pulled tight enough to cut. I invite her in because that's what the widow would do. Gracious despite pain, reaching for connection despite loss. We sit on the sofa James selected, drink tea from cups he never particularly liked, exchange pleasantries that scrape against my throat like swallowing sand. Diane updates me on neighborhood news, on her grandchildren's recent achievements, on the planning committee for the summer block party. I nod in appropriate places, ask questions that suggest continued investment in a community I'll never see again after next week. The burner phone in my pocket feels suddenly heavier, its presence a physical manifestation of the divide between what Diane sees and what actually exists. Does she notice how my eyes occasionally drift to the framed photo of James on the mantel? Does she interpret it as widowed longing rather than what it actually is? Private calculation, mental rehearsal, the continuous assessment of whether my performance remains convincing. As Diane prepares to leave, she pauses at the door, her hand touching my arm with unexpected gentleness. Helen, I hope this isn't overstepping, but have you thought about talking to someone professional? About the grief, I mean. My sister found it so helpful after she lost Richard. The question, its genuine concern, its innocent assumption that my struggle stems from loss rather than duplicity, lands like a physical blow. For one dangerous moment, I imagined telling her everything: the midnight boat transfer, the offshore accounts, the staged evidence of drowning, the calls that still come in the darkest hours when neighbors can't see the kitchen light glowing behind drawn curtains. The truth rises like bile in my throat, threatening to spill over, to end this exhausting charade with one moment of reckless honesty. Instead, I thank her for her concern, promise to consider her suggestion, wave from the porch as she returns to her car and her uncomplicated life where actions have predictable consequences and identity remains stable from one day to the next. The bedroom window frames a perfect rectangle of night sky, stars scattered across darkness like distant witnesses to the theater of deception playing out beneath their indifferent gaze. I sit at the vanity, methodically removing the minimal makeup I wore today, rituals of normality maintained while planning disappearance, while orchestrating erasure of identity cultivated through decades of careful construction. The wedding ring still rests in its dish beside the sink, James's matching band supposedly lost to ocean currents, to crushing depths, to fish and sand and salt that erase evidence more completely than any human effort could accomplish. My own gold band catches bathroom light as I twist it from my finger, the impression beneath having faded gradually through months of widow's performance, through continued wearing of symbol representing promises that transformed completely when tested against potential consequences. The bed stretches behind me, reflected in mirror-like monument to solitary grief that exists only for outside observation, for neighbors whose casseroles and sympathetic nods require reciprocal performance of healing but not healed, of moving forward but not forgetting, of learning to live alone while actually preparing for reunion with man everyone believes decomposing in oceanic grave never actually dug. Sleep comes differently now. No longer the unconscious surrender shared between bodies accustomed to each other's presence, but deliberate exercise requiring chemical assistance, requiring mental discipline to maintain separation between genuine exhaustion and caffeine-fueled alertness necessary for midnight communications conducted through encrypted channels with man who exists simultaneously as ghost and future, as past supposedly buried and future carefully constructed from pieces of fictional identity assembled through offshore accounts and falsified documentation. The suitcase waits in closet, not packed yet, but mentally inventoried through countless rehearsals of what remains essential when leaving behind entire life, entire identity, entire history, documented through photographs and legal records and neighbors' memories that will gradually fade as years pass without contact. One suitcase. James's instructions specified size and weight restrictions with precision characteristic of man who built financial empire through attention to details others overlooked, through exploitation of regulatory gaps others failed to notice, through confidence that inspired trust from clients who believed security more important than return on investment until discovering both had disappeared simultaneously, with man whose boating accident provided convenient explanation for funds suddenly inaccessible, for accounts suddenly empty, for promises suddenly revealed as elaborate construction without foundation, beyond carefully maintained appearance of stability. The burner phone rests on nightstand, charging cable connecting temporary technology to permanent electrical infrastructure that will continue serving this house long after current occupant disappears into elaborately constructed fiction already waiting across oceans. The clock reads 2:17. Time when insomnia typically peaks, when questions typically surface without daytime distractions to muffle their insistence, when doubts typically emerge from shadowed corners, where daylight activities push them during hours filled with performances observed by community still believing tragedy, rather than criminality explains absence supposedly mourned, rather than orchestrated. What happens when performance becomes more familiar than authenticity? What remains of original identity when deception requires such complete commitment that genuine reactions become distant memory rather than accessible response? The questions circle without resolution as night deepens around solitary figure reflected in mirror that witnesses daily transformation from authentic person to carefully constructed character. The dresser drawers contain carefully folded evidence of life built through decades of ordinary accumulation, clothes selected for professional advancement, for social confirmation, for personal comfort now categorized according to what remains necessary for transformation into someone else. What must be abandoned to maintain plausible deniability should investigators ever connect remaining dots into patterns suggesting cooperation rather than victimhood? The top drawer holds documents meant to appear innocuous, tax returns showing modest teacher's salary, mortgage statements revealing property nearly paid through decades of careful financial management, insurance policies listing beneficiaries who will never collect, because death supposedly documented through certificates filed with appropriate authorities never actually occurred. Beneath these ordinary papers rest components of escape. Passport photos meeting specifications of country whose documentation James acquired through connections never explained but easily inferred. Contact information encoded through system requiring specific key to translate random appearing numbers into actionable intelligence. Currency converted through series of transactions designed to eliminate traceable patterns that might reveal preparation rather than acceptance of fate. Supposedly determined by tragic accident. Beside the bed, photograph in silver frame catches moonlight filtering through partially open curtains. James and I on anniversary trip to Santorini, Mediterranean sun illuminating genuine smiles that predated investigation, that existed before terms like securities fraud and misappropriation of funds entered our vocabulary, before offshore accounts and falsified documentation became normalized through gradual erosion of boundaries, once separating ethical considerations from practical necessities. The happiness captured in frozen moment appears authentic because it was. Connection documented before deception transformed relationship from partnership into transactional arrangement, requiring specific performances from each participant, requiring recalibration of expectations from emotional fulfillment to practical continuation, from shared joy to shared complicity. When did love transform into logistics? When did husband become director orchestrating elaborate performance requiring wife's participation without providing genuine agency in determining script supposedly protecting both from consequences, but actually benefiting one more completely than other? Have you ever found yourself so entangled in someone else's narrative that extrication seems impossible without self-destruction? Have you participated in deception that began as temporary solution, but gradually transformed into permanent identity, more familiar than truth, sacrificed through 1,000 small surrenders that seemed individually reasonable, but collectively devastating when viewed through distance only time provides? The desk lamp casts a pool of yellow light across papers spread in careful organization, documents sorted according to importance, according to timeline for destruction or preservation, according to role in transformation about to occur. The study contains physical evidence of life constructed through decades of ordinary accumulation, now requiring systematic dismantling to prevent connections that might suggest preparation rather than victimhood. Bookshelf shadows stretch across walls like accusatory fingers pointing toward woman sitting alone at midnight, methodically separating financial records into piles representing different categories of deception, maintained through months of performance observed by investigators initially suspicious but gradually convinced by widow's consistent presentation of grief without knowledge, of loss without participation, of victimhood without collaboration in events leading to empty coffin. Buried beneath marble headstone bearing name of man, currently selecting tropical residence where reunion will occur exactly 6 days from now. Filing cabinet drawers stand partially open, their contents reduced through weeks of careful culling. Tax returns showing joint filings maintained until separation supposedly caused by death rather than strategic disappearance. Property records demonstrating accumulation through apparent legitimate means rather than funds diverted from investment accounts, supposedly managed according to fiduciary responsibility, actually abandoned when personal benefit conflicted with client interests. The shredder beside desk contains evidence of this systematic erasure, confetti-like remnants of documentation that might suggest foreknowledge, that might reveal preparation occurring before accident, supposedly claiming life actually preserved through elaborate staging involving unregistered boat. Coordinates memorized rather than recorded. Midnight transfer witnessed only by participants whose silence remains guaranteed, through shared complicity in deception that transformed. Investment advisor into criminal fugitive and wife into widow accomplice performing grief, with precision sufficient to convince federal investigators whose questions gradually transitioned from suspicion to sympathy. Computer screen glows with flight information displayed through private browsing session that will leave no record. Departure times, connection details, final destination described through generic terminology rather than specific location that might create traceable pattern leading toward man supposedly deceased, but actually establishing new identity in country selected specifically for absence of extradition treaty with United States. The reservation shows single traveler, woman whose passport bears photograph matching resident of this address, but name differing through subtle variation that appears clerical error rather than deliberate falsification designed to create plausible deniability should connection ever be discovered between widow supposedly grieving and woman traveling toward future constructed through resources, diverted before collapse became publicly acknowledged, before clients discovered investments, supposedly secured, actually dissipated through transactions designed to appear legitimate, while gradually transferring assets beyond regulatory reach. The desk calendar shows carefully maintained schedule of widows' appropriate activities, grief support group attendance creating witnesses who can testify to consistent presentation of loss without acceptance, of healing without completion, of moving forward without forgetting man whose absence supposedly resulted from tragic accident rather than calculated disappearance designed to avoid consequences of financial decisions made with full awareness of potential outcomes, but without concern for impacts extending beyond personal benefit. Tomorrow's square contains reminder of appointment with James's daughter, monthly lunch maintained through performance of tenuous connection preserved despite strained relationship predating disappearance, despite complications created through second marriage resented by adult child who viewed father's happiness as betrayal of mother abandoned through divorce rather than death. The irony doesn't escape me. Maintaining relationship with stepdaughter who resented my presence in her father's life while simultaneously preparing to disappear alongside man. She currently mourns through genuine grief based on artificial circumstances created specifically to avoid consequences that would have impacted his comfort without eliminating continued relationship with daughter, now deprived of father still living but permanently inaccessible due to choices prioritizing personal freedom above family connection. Wedding photograph on credenza catches desk lamp light. Younger versions of ourselves smiling with apparent genuine happiness that might have been authentic in moment captured, but gradually transformed through series of compromises individually reasonable, but collectively devastating when viewed through distance only time provides. The frame contains visible layer of dust. Not neglect, but deliberate maintenance of appearance suggesting widow gradually healing through reduced attention to reminders of supposedly lost husband, through appropriate progression from acute grief to functional adaptation, from constant awareness of absence to periodic acknowledgement of memory, gradually transformed from daily pain to occasional recognition. The performance extends to details invisible to casual observation, dust accumulation on certain photographs but not others, subtle rearrangement of items suggesting gradual reclaiming of space previously shared, careful maintenance of appearance indicating healing occurring at rate deemed appropriate by grief counselors, whose professional assessments provide additional verification of widowhood's authenticity through documentation, accessible should investigators ever renew interest in. Case officially classified as accident without evidence suggesting alternative explanation. The burner phone vibrates against desk surface, screen illuminating with message requiring no identification beyond encrypted numerical sequence, recognizable through key known only to participants in elaborately maintained deception. Passport confirmed active. Reservation verified. Final transfer complete. The communication contains no personal content, no expression of anticipation regarding reunion, no acknowledgement of sacrifice required to maintain performance convincing enough to satisfy investigators, whose initial suspicion gradually transformed into sympathy, For woman apparently victimized first by husband's financial crimes and subsequently by his accidental death. The clinical efficiency reflects relationships' transformation from emotional connection to practical arrangement, from marriage to business partnership requiring specific contributions from each participant without expectation of genuine engagement beyond transactions successfully completed. Have you ever realized that certain choices, once made, create momentum carrying you beyond point where alternative paths remain accessible? Have you recognized moment when participation in someone else's narrative has transformed your identity so completely that authentic self seems increasingly distant memory, rather than accessible alternative to character, gradually becoming more familiar than person who existed before performance began? The morning Elizabeth arrived at my door unannounced, 3 days before my scheduled departure. She carried the same photo album I'd discovered in the attic, its leather cover worn beneath her trembling fingers. "I found this while clearing Dad's old storage unit," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. The sunlight through the open door caught on her wedding band as she held the album toward me. The same light that once illuminated her father's deceptions, now revealing their continuation through generations, through relationships, through careful selection of what remains visible and what stays hidden. We sat at the kitchen table where James had first outlined his escape plan, where I had reluctantly agreed to participate in elaborate fiction, where the foundations of our shared future had been carefully constructed from material that could not possibly sustain the weight placed upon it. The burner phone in my pocket remained silent as we turned pages together. As Elizabeth revealed what she had always known about Caroline, about previous marriages, about patterns of appearance and disappearance stretching back through decades of her father's life before mine intersected with it. The suitcase in the attic remained packed but unmoved when the federal agents returned 3 days later, when they placed the empty passport on the kitchen table, alongside photographs of James taken the previous week in a country without extradition treaties. "He never planned for you to join him," the agent said, her voice carrying neither judgment nor comfort, simply delivering truth that had always existed beneath layers of deception I'd chosen not to recognize. The evidence they presented, emails to contacts arranging single accommodation, financial transfers to accounts in his name alone, surveillance photographs showing him with a woman whose blonde hair caught sunlight in painfully familiar ways, formed a constellation of betrayal that had always been visible had I been willing to truly see. The blue silk tie remained in the suitcase I never used, the wedding ring in the jewelry box I never emptied, the carefully constructed fiction of widow's grief transforming overnight into authentic mourning for a relationship that had never existed as I believed it did. The neighborhood watched with fresh curiosity as federal vehicles lined my driveway, as the woman they'd supported through tragic loss revealed herself as something more complex than simple victim, as truth emerged from elaborate staging to stand blinking in unforgiving daylight. Elizabeth visits monthly now, our relationship reconstructed from shared experience of betrayal rather than artificial connection through man who deceived us both. We sit on the porch swing that once held midnight calculations, that witnessed gradual erosion of moral boundaries, that supported the weight of decisions never fully acknowledged until consequences arrived with unstoppable momentum. The newspaper delivery still comes each morning. The neighbors still wave across carefully maintained lawns. The refrigerator still hums its mechanical rhythm through quiet nights, when sleep remains elusive despite exhaustion. The federal investigation continues its methodical progression: asset recovery, victim compensation, pursuit of fugitive who exists somewhere beyond reach of conventional justice. My participation in these proceedings, the full disclosure that came too late to prevent harm, but perhaps in time to facilitate healing, has transformed my position from potential defendant to cooperating witness, from accomplice to educator, helping others recognize patterns I missed until perspective shifted, until light caught familiar objects from angles revealing their true dimensions. The ocean, James supposedly drowned in, continues its eternal rhythm along shorelines I visit occasionally, my feet leaving temporary impressions in sand that remembers nothing of those who walk its surface. The water reflects sunlight differently each day, sometimes gentle ripples carrying illumination toward horizon, sometimes churning waves fragmenting light into momentary kaleidoscope patterns, sometimes flat calm creating mirror that returns sky's gaze with perfect fidelity. I stand at the edge where land meets water, where solid ground gives way to liquid uncertainty, where boundaries exist in constant negotiation rather than fixed demarcation. The truth about deception is that it begins not with elaborate staging, but with small compromises, with questions unasked, with explanations accepted despite inconsistencies, with trust granted without verification, with comfort chosen over clarity until self-deception becomes foundation for more substantial betrayal. Some journeys continue even after destinations change. Some paths reveal themselves only when we stop following maps drawn by others. Some truths emerge fully only when we finally acknowledge what we've always known. That authenticity, once surrendered for security, exacts continuing payment in currency of identity that no passport, however carefully forged, can ever fully restore. Have you ever recognized that the key to your own freedom was hidden not in elaborate escape, but in the simpler, more difficult act of finally standing still, in full visibility, accountable for every step that brought you to where you stand?